a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Professor Liang of Gonville and Keyes College, who I hope I can call Yao.
Of course.
Yao, there are many things which are covered in other interviews of you, but there are just one or two things that would be lovely to go into in a little more depth. One of them is the fact that we are sitting in a room which is directly above, a famous expert on Chinese history of science and philosophy, Joseph Needham. And although he was in a different subject, you were both in the same college and overlapped. And I wondered if you could say a few words about how you remember him and what his contribution was, or anything you would like to say.
I first encountered Joseph Needham when he gave a seminar at Imperial College, and I was most impressed. At that time I had no idea that some English people can speak Chinese or know Chinese at all. I have no idea who Joseph Needham was. And in the lecture he talked about, this is in 1960s, early 60s, he talked about magnetism and how compass work, the Chinese original compass work. And the word suspended needle in Chinese is xuan, zhen, and zhen is needle, xuan is actually suspended, referred to compass. Joseph actually managed to not only wrote the Chinese character on the board, but also explaining, he sort of dissect the word into why is it called xuan and the connection with magnetism. And partly it's because it's suspended, partly because it's magical. Xuan also has the meaning of magic, a magical needle, because it's always obviously pointing in the same direction no matter how you rotate it. That was very impressive, but only one seminar, and the next time I sort of encountered him was when on my first day visiting Cambridge, looking out from the senior tutor's window, and senior tutor said, "Do you know who that is walking down Tree Court Avenue?" And I said, "I have no idea. I've forgotten what he looked like, to be honest." And he said, "That's famous Dr. Needham." I said, "I have no idea." I said, "What did he do? What does it was a bit like that, but the senior tutor then thought, who admitted me to the college, thought the reason I came to the college was because of him, but I actually had no idea. But it was a very fortunate association with Joseph. We became very good friend, and yet a kind of friendship which had no conflict of interest, because there was no overlap in our subject. So it was a pure friendship without conflicts of interest, without rivalry or anything of the kind. In any case, I'm a lot younger than he. There was not, rivalry is out of the question, but nevertheless, it's just the normal academic rivalry just wouldn't have existed between us. And later on in life, I always dream about, partly of my own interest of making things, dream about recreating the tools or apparatus that those are described in his books, such as agricultural tools. Of course, he had made some water mills that he already got, but there are other tools which, to my rather innocent eye, didn't look very reasonable, very efficient of their design, efficient in terms of the force, and because it's agricultural tools. I thought I was going to help him set up a workshop, make this, call it instruments if you like, including clockwork, but life was too busy. To my eternal regret, we never had that. I never had the chance.
There are lots of things one would like to know. One is about about his political, the influence of his political views, because as you know, he was part of a movement with Bernal and others in the 1930s, which was very impressed by communism, and his visits to China during the Mao period confirmed his view that China was had many estimable features. Do you think his political views either got in the way or improved his science?
From my own observation, he wasn't a political animal. Basically, he had hardly any interest, except he was a person who was full of curiosity, who wanted to explore that dimension, the political dimension. He had many friends who are obviously known left-wingers like Bernal, but he wasn't getting on well with Bernal. This is the father of Martin. I can't remember his first name. At Birkbeck College, London, and I mean one of his great friends was the vicar of the Red Vicar in Dagstedt, for example, and he never visited Russia. He absolutely would not join Spanish Civil War, and the only reason he joined in on the general strike was to fulfill his childhood dream of piloting or driving a locomotive. That was the reason. He did dabble a little bit onto politics, where at that time clearly got himself into trouble, and later on proved, at least from the historical paper, he was wrong. That's about the war, the germ warfare during the Korean War. He was of the belief then that America used germ in the war with Korea, North Korea. Of course, this cost him, if you like, quite a lot of friends in the right quarter, if you like. He didn't care much about that in any case, but regrettably he was barred from entering America for the rest of his life, and until almost the last year of his life, 1994, 95, when he was awarded honorary degree. I can't even remember, to be honest, whether he went in person or he got somebody else to receive it for him. But that was a time when he was given the visa. Before that, the America refused him visa, and the reason was this slight fracas really with the American government on germ warfare. And now the paper had been released. It was proved that Joseph was wrong. That's quite an interesting episode. It's just an episode, but I don't think, going back to my first statement, I don't think he was a political animal. He did various unusual things with communist China, with Mao regime in particular, which I found at odds with my own judgment and belief. Again, it was not because of politics he either approved or disapproved. It was for his own intellectual pursuit. His mind was focused on to finishing his book, had a lot of areas of science and civilization of China which had not been catalogued, written up, and he wanted to keep that avenue of being able to collect first materials in China firsthand. In the 60s, 70s, even in the early 70s, the archaeological discovery in China was relatively just almost non-existent compared to today. There was no terracotta army, nothing like that, and the burial place of the Han woman, the jade suits, and so on. This is pre that time, and Joseph's only interest is so that he could go on with his work. But he, to me, at least at the time, he did say something which about the Red Guards and how wonderful Red Guards were. It was totally illogical to my mind, but he did, and I understand even then and now that that was really because he wanted to enable this avenue to China to be kept open.
Well, that is a sensitive and interesting period, because I heard a sermon he gave which I've got a recording of, in 1972, I think, after he'd made one of his visits, and he talks very, very glowingly about China and how wonderful it is. And already many people in the West knew about both the Great Leap Forward and the famines and the Cultural Revolution. And I've often wondered whether he knew and concealed it, or whether he really didn't know what had happened.
I have to share your doubt as well as a kind of sense of mystery about Joseph's behavior. I think in some way, he was probably naive. On the other hand, he could not have been that naive. It's one of those a difficult one to sort of to judge where he falls. For example, must be the same after the same visit to China in 1972. Come back here, talk to undergraduate society, praising how wonderful it was that the wall, the city wall of Peking were dismantled, and if bricks could now be used or are now used for citizens or ordinary people to build their own houses, this is a fantastic progress to Joseph. I just could not imagine how a historian could have that view. And he also visited his former assistant Cao Tianqin, who was a first Chinese fellow in this college in the early 50s. I mean, that's another very touching story. In Shanghai, and Cao was the head of the biochemistry, the Chinese science, Sinica, Academy Sinica. He was a director in Shanghai, and could have been credited for the first artificial making of a synthesis of insulin. But anyway, that's by the. It's not why I'm saying him. The reason I bring him up is because Joseph met up with him. This is in 1972. Although it's towards the end of Cultural Revolution, but still in the depth of Cultural Revolution. And Joseph reported back to me that Cao was very well, and I asked him whether they treated him well, and his answer was very good and no problem. And Joseph said, "There you are. I told you, there's no problem." But what Joseph did not tell me, but later on Cao himself told me that sitting around the table where they met was the party man supervising. So he said, Cao told me that he couldn't really say very much, and that was that. But could Joseph have been that naive? I do not know. I cannot have a view of how he behaved in 1972 or about the time.
What do you think of the idea that maybe having early on found a political philosophy and a social philosophy which was idealistic and seemed to help him think of an alternative to advanced Western capitalism, when it became clear that it had many faults to it, he found it rather difficult to abandon. Koestler wrote a book called The God That Died or something, which was a study of a number of people like Orwell and others who realized that the communist faith was a faith and you could no longer believe it. But there's another very famous example, which is Eric Hobsbawm, who knew what Stalin had done, and until his death, and he has died now, refused to admit what Stalin had done, because it would mean an undermining of all that he'd believed in.
I don't have such a strong feeling of attributing Joseph as a political philosopher. As I say, he wasn't a political animal. What he did was convenient for the time, for his purpose. It wasn't a question of giving up a belief or his original utopian or idealistic vision of the world being destroyed. I think the reason he befriends a lot of quite strange people, to my mind, one of the strangest things is to go to his party, or to which I frequent invitee, and you meet people totally surprised that in fact this person, just anybody walking in the street, Joseph would invite him or her to the party, and join in the kind of college. It's a college party. It's a master's party, you see. But that was Joseph. I mention this because Joseph liked to explore different avenues of life, color. In fact, it's all to make himself and his environment more colorful. It was curiosity, it was interest in people, in what they do, but not very deep, and nevertheless, because he may invite this person to party tonight and then never invite that person again. There were really only very few people whom as I say, I went to his party frequently. I rarely see the same person more than 2 or 3 times or 4 times, and that was Joseph. But there were a few constant friends, like I was saying, the vicar of Texted Church. You know about the Red Vicar, and his successor is also Red, and 1 or 2 others. But other than that, all the other people are just fleeting and transient partygoers.
He wrote a huge amount. I mean, obviously many of the volumes were written by others, but he himself contributed a huge amount on many different subjects. He was obviously a polymath. You had the rooms above him. Did he just work incredibly hard, or what is the secret of his ability?
Well, he supervised all the different volumes or parts of different parts of the volume of Science and Civilization of China. First of all, the correction about I occupied this room. At that time, I was a mere ordinary fellow. I had room in the other court. I did not know that about him. But my wife was his personal assistant for many years. At that time, when I was a research fellow and then teaching fellow, and then later my wife became the librarian of Needham Institute. Anyway, through my wife, and therefore I visit her when she was working with Joseph, know a little bit about Joseph's work. Yes, he worked exceedingly hard, and he also kept very good record of everything he did, and he would write. He never missed the opportunity for recording. So in his index card box, full of college menus, dinner menu, the backside of it, he whatever discussion he had with people, drawing and sketches, he would then cut it out and put it in there. So he was very methodical in record keeping, and he certainly worked very hard. Talking about writing stuff on the back of something, to my great annoyance, because I'm a very keen photographer, and he would write on his own family photograph of, such as one with him sitting on his mother's laps. He was probably 2 or 3 year old, 2 year old, and in order to fit the card, the photograph onto his index card box, he had to cut it a bit off to make it small enough to go in there, and he cuts his head off just on his forehead. Those photographs were precious. In fact, they were treasure now. But I lost the forehead of Joseph, and of course, you probably know his mother was a very well-known songwriter. Did you know that? And children songwriters, and Joseph continued to enjoy the royalty paid to her compositions, and all the way until he died. I don't know what happened now. Obviously, because Joseph had no children, so that's probably come to an end. But Joseph's mother was a songwriter. Father was a physician.
One of the people he both worked with and fell out with was a man called Lawrence Pickin,
Yes.
Who was, I think, a biologist or zoologist, and who later developed a huge interest in Chinese and Asian musical instruments. Did you meet Lawrence?
No, I never met him, never had the opportunity. Maybe by association with Joseph, I just a barrier had been sort of erected between us, between Pickin and myself, and I also knew very little of Pickin until towards his later life, when I think he became unwell, and by then it's too late to really have much interaction with him.
Did Joseph ever talk about him or?
No.
Yeah.
So I really couldn't say very much about Pickens other than what people told me, rather than from Joseph. I don't even know whether Pickin actually wrote or left a lot of writing. I think I understand he was a great collector of instruments, which are now passed on to the music department as well as the Oriental department. Beyond that, I know nothing about him.
If you mention the word Joseph Needham to a certain set of intellectuals, they'll immediately say, oh yes, the Needham question.
Yes.
And the Needham question is, very simply, why was a civilization which by 1200, 1300, one of the two leading science civilizations, or technology stroke science civilizations along with Islam, why was it thereafter that it faded away and that the scientific revolution, as we now call it, occurred in the West? Did you ever discuss that question with him?
I never discussed that question specifically with him. I know it somehow bothered him. However, it hadn't bothered me that much. This is entirely my own view, that of course, although Chinese history goes back a long time, but in essence is what the Chinese saying, you change the soup but not the medicine. So every dynasty comes back and just repeat themselves, and there was very little kind of incentive or motivation, and of course plagued with civil war. But I think there is another reason for it, and I wish I had a chance to discuss it with Joseph, because I think although on the one hand people talk about how great the China as a united country, united by language, by system of measurements, that's of course the first emperor contribution, and the system of government. But when a country is that big, there's necessarily the political dictatorship and tyranny almost necessary, otherwise it will just break up. And looking back to Chinese civilization, the most, in terms of progress in science and technology and arts, the best period have often been associated with the period where politically China was broken up. Take it from the beginning, the period of spring autumn, China consisting of 12, 13 states, smaller states, eventually becomes 6 states when during the warring period, that's 100 years later. And the Chunqiu Zhanguo, the Chunqiu part especially, where Confucius was, Lao Tzu was, and their ideas, their philosophy were allowed to flourish because they weren't controlled, or at least the people who controlled them didn't feel strong enough to really stranglehold what the people should think and should do. That was a really flourishing period of China in terms of the civilizations. And later on, after Han, again chaos. That's the Sui Chao, the 5th century. Of course, the Chunqiu period was 300 BC, and the Sui period, that's pre-Tang. Again, that was flourishing in all kinds of literature, sculpture, and lots and lots of relics in China, like the big Buddha and in Shanxi, the various places, where what was left during that period, the pre-Tang period, just immediately pre-Tang period, and going to looking at some of the digs, you probably you should know more than I do. By the time it developed into Tang period, things begin to sort of settle down, and in fact the creativity aspect of it dies as the country become politically stronger and stronger, and that was the trouble. I think I go back to how I can't talk about political unitedness of the politics become a hindrance. It could be, if I had a chance to discuss it with Joseph, I would venture to suggest that it is the political unity of China, the country as a big country united. Every Chinese you talk to might tell you how proud he or she is because the country is united. But in fact, that could be the answer for this the hindrance to development. Europe, quite different, of course. It's broken into so many different states, each state allowed to develop. The Middle Ages between Italy and Holland and France, and that's a development, because not only they compete, rivalry, but also there's no such a strong control about what people are allowed to think. Of course, Galileo and so on suffer. That's religions, but on the whole, the freedom to think were sort of given to the people, and I think that's a very important aspect. And again, talking even today, why are there no Nobel Prizes in China? Because people are not, or until recently, I don't know now what happened, not allowed to think. That's part of their education system. It's dangerous to allow people to think. I don't know whether you want to put this in public record, but not allowing people to think is one of the greatest ill of strong politics. So strong countries, strong politics, just no good for them.
Well, coming out of that, two thoughts. One was I didn't catch the Chinese, obviously, the idea that China constantly comes back to itself, to an earlier formation.
Yeah.
It breaks into bits and then it reforms. Some people say that's what's happening now, that after the early 20th century disruptions and then Maoist unification, it's now going through a period of consolidation and centralization and going back to an imperial system with its current leader as the new emperor. Do you feel that China constantly does that and is doing that now?
It's hard for me to comment on that, I think, because clearly the political philosophy is very different of today's China and even pre-1980s China. Now mind comparing it with the pre-1949 China. But in there, one thing hasn't changed very much, certainly in Mao's time, is control. I mean, just everything must be under control because the country is so big. There's no halfway between either you keep everyone, sort of, again I use the word control, in communist China, in Mao's China, every street has a spy who is of course given some very fancy name, but they're really there to report to somebody, to the authority, if there is a strange person visiting so and so house and staying overnight and so on, and that's control. And I mean, it extends to education. I mean, that's the biggest harm, biggest damage is the extension to education. But earlier on, if the breaking up period extend to 200 years, such as the Sui period, that's before Tang, that give people, I mean, 200 years is almost 6 to 8 generations, enough time to develop their creativity, to put their creativity into test, into making things. That was good enough. But most of the time when they changed dynasty, it happened very quickly. It happened very quickly, and then the new regime established itself also very quickly. And within when I say very quickly, maybe one generations. And that just wasn't enough time to promote this creative activity to flourish, which is a great pity. But politicians just got worse and worse, I think.
But what alternative is there for a country of the size of China? I mean, you said that it has got to be centrally and powerfully controlled to keep such a huge population. Many people obviously, hopefully say, well, why don't you try Western democracy and so on? But is there any way of doing
it? It would lead
that?
to chaos, wouldn't it? Yes, it would lead. That's what Chinese government is most afraid of. Democracy brings chaos into the place. That's why, for example, Russia and practically going back under Putin to this authoritarian stage. When one asks what is the answer, depends what you think is important, what you want. If you are somebody, if I'm talking as a Chinese descendant person, and always as though the biggest thing, the most important thing about being Chinese is to be proud of your country, to be big, to have influence, to have all kinds of things like that. Those are the slogans used by politicians. Then yes, carry on. But if going back to your first question about Joseph's big question, then in some way breaking things up, not a bad solution, but whether that is a serious suggestion, obviously no one could will even imagine that it's a possibility, because politicians always want to centralize power, centralize everything. Look at Europe, and the same, of course, China. They're not going to give up. But if the way I answer your question is that if you're really looking for making the place science technologically more advanced quickly, breaking the political system is not a bad solution, but no one's going to do that.
Which maybe takes us to Cambridge, because some people say that the reason why Cambridge has 54 Nobel Prize winners, or whatever it is, China none, is because it's broken up into these small competing units, both the departments and faculties and also the colleges. Do you think that is one of the reasons for its creativity?
Very much so. That, of course, beyond I would go further than that. Of course, the college or the collegiate system of bringing people together, this what's the word? Not synoptic, and people from different disciplines have very natural. I mean, come to the college, live together, eat together, and in a very natural way, and relax together. Make up a very important synergy is the word I was trying to use. Make a very important factor of success, of Cambridge success. But it's also luck. Sometimes if you compare the number of Nobel Prizes in Cambridge, it's very uneven per college. I mean, you look at Trinity and compare with St. John's, the two colleges until recently, until Felixstowe at least, almost of comparable wealth, equally situated along the river. And why Trinity got so many more than St. John's in terms of Nobel Prize? Of course, Nobel Prize is not everything, but just in terms of Nobel Prize, Trinity has far more than St. John's. The reason is beyond me. Maybe it's feng shui.
Feng shui. It's as good an explanation as
when you can't explain it, you say feng shui.
Which takes me to perhaps finally your own work. In your other interview, I'm not sure whether you were asked about how you work, how you think. I mean, you've shown me this wonderful notebook of yours when you were a student, of your very neat handwriting and your beautiful equations and diagrams. When do your best thoughts come to you, and can you give any hints to a young student who is trying to be a creative worker, whether in science or any other field, about how best to work?
I don't think I've set a very good example for anyone. One of the things is, from my own personal experience, is this kind of thing cannot be planned for. The opportunistic factor, such as meeting the right people at the right time, the right place, certain conversation and so on, will suddenly lead to spark in ideas. You can't plan for that. I certainly can't plan for that. But trying to answer your questions, it really an important element of that, which you mentioned, my notebook, for example, is when I rather hate to say myself, but I continue. I started answering your question. Is always try to do your best for the time being, and with the utmost seriousness. For example, as a student, I consider my task is to study, to get as much knowledge as possible from whatever lay in front of me, and do that, and not consider the result. The result will just come out if you're lucky. Because you don't consider the results. If it doesn't come, I won't be too disappointed either. is fine, but I have been extremely lucky all my life, and there always are people almost like some fantastic star over there looking down at me and provided me with the direction. When there are 2 ways or 3 ways to go in front of me, somebody will point me in the right place, in the right direction. So those things are not something that I can plan for, and I don't know how to advise. Certainly no position to advise anybody. But I would say one thing is this: to treat the job in hand or on hand with the utmost seriousness, and try to do your best and not think about reward. I don't know if that is really how it works, but that's how I work.
One thing you mentioned is that you can't plan who you meet and so on. The thing that has influenced my work most in my life is my wife, Sarah Harrison, with whom I've worked for 40 years, and we share everything in way of work. And I realised that without her, I would have been half the person that I have been. And I know you had a very close relationship with your wife, and you mentioned her as Joseph's secretary. Is there anything you'd like to say about your relationship with her in relation to work or anything else?
My wife had a strong artistic streak about her, and although she was trained as a mathematician, but I think buried underneath has always been trying to create in the visual art, particularly painting and so on, and literature as well. So being a scientist, we don't have much overlap in our interests, and I'm always being told as being so ignorant and forget it, don't ask silly questions. but otherwise, and wherever we can help and collaborate, when I always do, but I'm less fortunate than you, because our interests really are very different, and my fortune in terms of the human contact, I really made outside family in the college, in the departments, and so on. And I would be nowhere at all without help of friends, and right from day one, especially day one, stepping out from my ship, coming over from the Far East to Tilbury, docking at Tilbury dock in London, and literally from then on, any moment I could have disappeared into nothing and sunk to nothing, but that always there was somebody there to help me. It's absolutely amazing.
Well, that's a nice point to end at, but what I'm going to do is to just pan the camera up to a painting,
yes,
which was done by your wife, I believe.
Yes, it's her last painting.
Her last painting. So, with your wife's last painting and your last words there, just for the time being anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.